So, yeah, I'm going to talk to you for the next hour or so about an intervention that we've developed here in the UK called social recovery therapy for psychosis. It's going to be a bit of a whistle stop kind of introduction in an hour. But what I hope to be able to do, and hopefully my slides are moving along, what I hope to be able to talk to you about is what we mean when we're talking about social recovery, how we can measure it. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we measure it in our studies, and also think with you a little bit about why people might experience difficulties with this type of recovery following an episode of psychosis. I then am going to spend most of the time introducing you to social recovery therapy and the accompanying evidence base, and give you a little bit of a flavour or taster of some of the social recovery therapy techniques. So before I start, just a bit of a shout out for our website. So this is where all of our resources are. You'll find out a little bit more about the team behind social recovery therapy. So it's me talking to you today, but this has been developed very much in collaboration with David Fowler and Paul French in the UK as well. So you can hear a little bit more, read a little bit more about the wider team on the website, download some of our materials. It's free to sign up to the website, so there's no charge for downloading any of the materials, but you will need to log in and create a free account on the website in order to be able to access those materials. But do take a look at that if you're interested. We also have a YouTube channel with some videos on there showing you some examples of us actually applying the social recovery therapy techniques. So do go ahead and have a look at that as well if you're interested following today. So moving swiftly on, starting out by thinking about what social recovery is. So when we talk about social recovery, we're talking about engagement in activities within occupational and interpersonal domains. So that does include things like work and education, but it's also a broader construct, including valued social activities and relationships with other people. So by the social aspect of it, we're really talking about people making connections or reconnecting with other people within their social world and within their social networks across a range of different activities that may bring meaning. And we know from previous research, some of this is quite old now, but actually these figures, I was looking recently at more recent papers, haven't really changed. That actually, whilst we tend to focus a lot on symptomatic recovery, social and functional aspects of recovery are much poorer following psychosis. So evidence suggests that less than half of people achieve social recovery. And when you think about re-engagement with work, that drops to a further kind of 10 to 20% of people, despite the fact that actually most people, when you ask them, will say that actually this is what they want to do. This is the type of recovery that they're looking for. And actually it has been found to be one of the most valued parts of recovery following psychosis. So we know that actually functional and social difficulties actually start to emerge before the onset of psychosis. So the green line on this graph would be a kind of symptomatic profile. So you see like a peak where there might be a psychotic episode and maybe smaller peaks later on. But then actually social disability, evidenced by the yellow line on this graph, starts early and can actually remain beyond the acute episode of psychosis itself, which results in what has been called the symptom disability gap, that even when symptoms remit, people are still struggling with other aspects of recovery. And that's really what we're trying to focus here when we're talking about targeting social recovery. So in terms of how we measure this, it's quite tricky to measure these kinds of things. We have lots of tools available for measuring symptoms or distress or conviction in beliefs, or, how frequently hallucinations happen. But when we think about functional outcomes, there's a much lower or much more limited amount of tools that we have. So we measure social disability and social recovery using something called the Time Use Survey, which was a tool that was actually originally developed by the Office for National Statistics here in the UK, who were conducting a survey of how adults in the UK spend their time. And we've adapted that so that it can be used in more clinical populations. but it also enables us to compare the amount of time that people are engaging in activity with a kind of non-clinical average. So we know from the data from the Office for National Statistics that in the general non-clinical population, adults are generally spending around 60 to 65 hours per week in structured activity. It includes work, leisure activities, social activities, childcare, housework, education, a range of these different things. And we're defining social disability as when people are engaging in less than 30 hours per week in those kinds of activities, so around half of what a non-clinical average would be. And we've got this tool which you can download from our website. It's an interview which you can do with people where you literally go through with them and ask them what kinds of activities they've been doing over the last month. And it creates a score in terms of average hours per week that you can then use to work out how people are doing. So we define social disability on this tool as people who are engaging in less than 30 hours per week in structured activity, and where that's been we might call that persistent social disability when that's been going on for 6 months or more. So why are we focusing on time use? Well, as I said before, there's a fairly limited range of tools available for assessing functional and social outcomes for people with psychosis. You've got quite old measures which talk about things like the deficit syndrome, but they very much focus on things like, can somebody cook for themselves, dress themselves, all of those activities. And actually young people with first episode psychosis tend to have different difficulties. Or at the other end of the spectrum, you've got outcomes which are very focused on whether or not somebody's engaged in work or whether somebody's attending college, which we felt was actually quite a limited range of outcomes to focus on. And of course, work and education are important, but they're not the only markers of recovery. And actually some other kinds of activities, social activities, leisure activities, are often quite important stepping stones to people returning back into work or education. So we wanted something that was a bit more inclusive than that, and that focused on a range of activities that were meaningful to people. And that's why we chose to focus on this kind of broader measure of time use. And we know from research that's been done in this area that actually measuring time use is important. It measures participation in a range of activities which can have benefits to people on a number of levels. And we know that time spent in these kinds of activities has previously been shown to be associated with increased well-being. We're really working on the premise that actually engaging in activity gives meaning to people's lives, which is really important when you're talking about recovery. So we've done a bit of work using the time use survey to look at when in psychosis, across the spectrum of psychosis, social functioning difficulties occur. So we did some research a few years ago now, comparing weekly hours spent in structured activity across a number of groups: a non-clinical group, a group who were at risk for psychosis, a group who were experiencing a first episode of psychosis, and then a group who were perhaps struggling with recovery a few years after their first episode. And we found that compared to the non-clinical average of, as I said before, 60 to 65 hours, there was a reduction in activity in people who were at risk of psychosis, perhaps unsurprising because, we know that actually in terms of defining at-risk mental state, a reduction in functioning is part of that definition. A further reduction for people in the first episode psychosis group, but that actually after that first episode, when you follow people up for a few years, there wasn't a lot of people were remaining in low levels of activity, and you can see that delayed recovery group are stuck at around kind of 20 hours per week in structured activity compared to the 65 in the non-clinical group. So we did a little bit more longitudinal work to look at, well, what happens over time, and we followed up a group of people following their first episode of psychosis over a 12-month period to see what happened in terms of their structured activity, and did some longitudinal modelling of this. And you can see the red dotted line on this graph is showing you that non-clinical average of around 65 hours per week. And we found that we had three latent classes of people, or three different groups within our first episode psychosis sample. And this was a group of around 900 or so young people with first episode psychosis. We found that there was this group at the top, as evidenced here by the light blue line, about 7% of the sample actually started off with really quite high levels of activity, which over that first year came down to around about the non-clinical average. And these are the people who perhaps have more of an effective presentation, maybe people who experience some mania in the context of their psychosis, and so their activity was maybe a little bit too high and it's then coming down as they recover to around the non-clinical average. Then got this middle group reflected there by the dark blue line that start off relatively low or with a reduced amount of activity of around kind of just below 40 hours, but then are coming back up over that first year to more in line with the non-clinical average. But then we've got this group, which sadly is the biggest group at the bottom, that actually start off with very low levels of activity, around sort of 10-12 hours per week at the start of their episode. And then even after 12 months of quite intensive early intervention provision, are still below 20 hours per week, and you've got 66% of the sample in that group. So it's really demonstrated to us that there is this quite significant group of people in early intervention services who are really struggling with their social recovery even a year after that first episode. And when we looked at what predicted membership of that low activity group, being male, having a younger age of your onset of your first episode, having poor premorbid adjustment in adolescence prior to your first episode of psychosis, having a longer duration of untreated psychosis, belonging to an ethnic minority group, and having higher levels of baseline negative symptoms. They were the people who were particularly at risk of poor social recovery over that 12-month period. So we think about why this might be. I mean, that work really demonstrated to us that, actually something needs to be done here. We need some targeted work, even in the context of, a really high quality early intervention service provision. There's still more that needs to be done to support this type of recovery. And when we think about why social recovery might be an issue for people with psychosis, if we think about it, and this probably won't be news to a lot of you here today, but the onset of first episode psychosis usually occurs in adolescence or young adulthood. This is a really key developmental stage in terms of people starting to develop independence, starting to think about their adult identity and their adult sense of self and who they are in the world and where they want to go in their lives. People may have just started college, university, first jobs, moved out of home for the first time. So actually it's a really key developmental stage where an episode of psychosis can really have a huge impact and a devastating impact at that. So, we know that label of psychosis is often associated with shame, stigma, a sense of failure, and is likely to impact on some of that developing sense of self in adulthood. And research supports this, suggesting that quite a lot of people following psychosis experience life disruptions, feel like their future aspirations have been threatened, and as a consequence of their psychosis or as a consequence of their circumstances prior to the psychosis, are experiencing social exclusion and stigma. We did some research when we were developing social recovery therapy as well, thinking about people's views for the future and what they wanted for themselves in the future. So we asked a group of young people with first episode psychosis to think about their future selves, and what they wanted for themselves in the future. And here are some of the quotes of things that they said. So, I'd like to be a nurse, a musician, want to be independent, want to meet a partner, spend time with friends, maybe go to university. These are all hopes and aspirations that many young people will have. They're not things that shouldn't be attainable just because you've had an episode of psychosis. It's not that people don't have hopes for the future or have hopes that actually they're not going to be able to reach. These are all should be very attainable things. But we also asked people what their fears were for the future, and these are some of the things that they said. So living in a mental hospital, things not working out, reliving the abuse that I've experienced in my life, having low confidence and nerves, and not being independent. And when we were talking with people about what when they were thinking about their future selves, what they were kind of more guided by, it was the fears about the future that were actually holding people back. So people were worried that actually, if they did try and attain those hopes that they had for the future, that things wouldn't work out, that they might relapse, they might end up in a mental hospital, and therefore that was stopping them or holding them back from working towards their hope for possible selves in the future. And actually, most of their efforts were around protecting themselves from their fears not coming true rather than working towards some of those hopes for the future. So there are lots of things to consider in terms of barriers to social recovery, and these are the things that we thought quite a lot about in the development of the intervention. And why I'm talking to you about this work before I talk to you about the intervention in itself is to hopefully demonstrate to you that the intervention that we've then developed has very much had a basis in some of this underpinning work, really understanding what the difficulties people with psychosis are experiencing, and then how we can perhaps work together with people to overcome some of these barriers. So there are a number of barriers. Some are individual and personal, so people being very worried about their psychosis coming back. Many people still living with low-level psychotic symptoms, even if the acute episode has remitted. People struggling with perhaps more what we might think of as more negative symptoms or low mood. People struggling with motivation, but also having low expectations for enjoyment and pleasure. Possibly again coming from that desire to protect the self from the things that people fear. Psychosis really having knocked people's confidence and hopes for the future. People saying that they didn't feel like they had any confidence left. And avoiding, as I was talking about before, about kind of avoiding the fears, being concerned about what's going to happen if people try and reach for the things that they want in life, and withdrawing as a form of kind of self-protection. But it's not just about the personal and individual barriers that people face. There are lots of systemic barriers in the networks and the systems that surround people. So, people talked a lot about their family and family influences, and people telling them that, oh, actually, you need to protect yourself. You need to not push yourself. We don't want you to relapse. Maybe take it easy. Don't work. We'll look after you, or you just don't want to push yourself too hard. But also stigma. People worrying about, how do I talk to people about the fact that I've had an episode of psychosis? Are people going to want to employ me when they find out that I've spend time in hospital, or that I've had to take a year out or 2 years out to get well again? Like, how am I going to explain that gap in my CV, and what are people going to think about that? So stigma from the self, but also, stigma experienced from other people losing friends and social networks because people don't know how to respond to the fact that somebody has been very unwell. And the very real systemic barriers relating to poverty and poor living conditions. People actually not having that safe and strong foundation of a safe place to live and all of their basic needs being met, so that they can then think about kind of higher aspirations about work and future selves and things. But actually, people just striving to just keep their basic safety, and that being a real barrier for people. So what can we do about this? We've got this quite substantial group of people who are really struggling to move towards the life they want to live following an episode of psychosis. And, what can we do? How can we support people who are stuck? So that led us to the development of social recovery therapy. And social recovery therapy is underpinned by cognitive behavioral therapy, but it differs from other forms of psychological therapy for psychosis because the focus is very much on the individual's values and goals, hopes for the future, the things that they want to achieve, promoting activity and social recovery, as opposed to reducing symptom related issues. Although obviously symptoms may come into the picture if people are worried about relapse, or actually if people are struggling with residual psychotic symptoms, if people are still hearing voices or experiencing low-level paranoia, then obviously they do need to feature in this intervention. But the focus very much is on activity, and social recovery as opposed to symptomatic recovery. So the formulation then, and what we're trying to understand is social recovery from the perspective of the individual. We're trying to work out what are people's hopes, values, goals for the future, and what's causing problems with those, what are the barriers to those, and how can we support people to overcome those barriers and move towards the life they want to live. So we use cognitive techniques, and as in other forms of CBT, but the focus is very much about developing a sense of optimism and agency and building positive beliefs, as opposed to a focus perhaps on challenging negative beliefs. There's a large emphasis on the use of behavioural strategies. So as you'll see, as I talk later on in the presentation, behavioural work is really key to this approach. So there are sessions where we think about cognitive restructuring and all of those kinds of techniques, but actually behavioural work is really at the fore and features largely in this intervention. So if we were thinking about CBT, it would be a big B in there. So we use the evidence and the experiences that are gained from that behavioural work to further instill hope and promote positive beliefs about the self. So the very real experiences that people have through the behavioural work are used and brought into the formulation to try and help people to build a more positive sense of self. And we're not just working with the individual here. This is the other kind of really key part about social recovery therapy. There's a lot of one-to-one individual work, but we're also thinking about the wider system and thinking about, is there any work that we need to do within the family? If somebody's at college or returning to work, is there any work that we need to do with teachers in the college or potential employers or people at work, to make sure that everybody is on the same page and that we're thinking about breaking down barriers, not just within the individual, but also within the wider system. So the focus on the positive, focus on social recovery, the focus on behavioural work and the focus on some of that systemic work, I think are probably the key kind of unique factors relating to this intervention. So it's very assertive. We use assertive outreach principles. It's a very flexible approach. We're not necessarily expecting people to always come in and sit in an office or sit in a clinic room and talk with a therapist. We're seeing people where they feel comfortable. We're going out to see people where they are. We're very much working alongside and accompanying people in the activities that they want to do. As I've talked about, I won't repeat this here because I think we've talked about this already. There is a basis of CBT techniques in terms of building up that positive sense of self, and using behavioural type work to promote positive experiences and use the evidence from those positive experiences to think about further building up that positive sense of self. And we're also focusing on that kind of multi-systemic principles as well, around thinking about the wider system around the person. So, I mean, this is labouring the point slightly here, but, support is at all levels. We're thinking about the person, we're thinking about their immediate family and friends around them, but we're also thinking about the wider system. Oh, there we go. So in terms of the stages of social recovery therapy, we talk about it as being a kind of 3-stage approach. And I'm going to go through these different stages in a bit more detail shortly. But stage 1 is very much focused on assessment and formulation. So really thinking about developing a good shared understanding of where the person is now, where they want to be, and what's getting in the way. And promoting hope throughout that process. So often, a lot of the people who are quite stuck may have lost hope. So actually a big part of this intervention is about the therapist holding that hope and trying to instill hope within the individual, but also within the wider system around that person. Stage 2 then starts to think about identifying and working towards medium to long-term goals, thinking again about holding onto that hope and building that hope and positive identity, and starting to think about, well, we know where you want to get to, how are we going to get there, what are the pathways that we're going to use to try and move closer towards where you want to be. And then the third stage is very much around that active promotion of structured and meaningful activities, where we're doing a lot of active behavioural work, a lot of supporting engagement with other organisations and activities to really try and move people closer towards where they want to be. So in terms of what it looks like, we talk about a kind of dose of social recovery therapy being at least 6 sessions, and the core components of that being a good assessment and formulation of the difficulties completed, and at least 2 pieces of behavioural work completed with the therapist outside of the clinic room. However, in practice, when we've looked at our trials and what's delivered in the trials, the median number of sessions is around 19, and delivered over a 9-month period. So whilst we say that you can do the basics in 6 sessions, and I suppose for some people that might be all they need, it generally, when we've done it in the trials that we've done, has been a more intensive intervention. We've got an adherence scale that we've developed and published, and you can download a copy of that from the website, which talks about the different components of the intervention that should be present in order for it to be adherent social recovery therapy. And I can talk a bit more about that if people have questions later on. So in terms of the evidence base, does it work? So we've done a number of trials of this intervention so far. So there are 2 kind of key trials that I'm going to talk to you about. One was a trial that we did quite a number of years ago now, a sort of feasibility or pilot trial, where we were really trying to sort of understand the intervention a little bit more. And we did this intervention in the context of early intervention services in the UK, but also some community mental health teams with people who'd had psychosis within the last 8 years. So we talked about early psychosis as being having had your first episode in the last 8 years. Within this particular trial, we recruited people with affective psychosis and non-affective psychosis. So we had people with schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, but also some people with bipolar disorder in this trial. What we learned through doing this was that combining affective and non-affective psychosis together, the intervention didn't look like it had much of an impact on activity. When we focused solely on people with non-affective psychosis, so predominantly schizophrenia type diagnoses, we did see an effect of the intervention compared to treatment as usual. So off the back of this study, we then decided that actually our focus here was going to be that this was an intervention that was around supporting people with non-affective as opposed to affective psychosis. And I think what's kind of key really here in sort of that understanding is that a lot of the intervention is about kind of activating people's activity levels. So, understanding why people have such low activity levels and then trying to activate more activity to increase that over time. And whilst that can be beneficial for people with more effective presentations, we found through doing this trial that actually people with more effective presentations perhaps needed more support with regulation. So it wasn't necessarily the case that people with more effective presentations couldn't or weren't able to activate themselves. It was that sometimes they had quite low activity levels, and sometimes it went too high, and it was about keeping that on a bit more of an even keel. Whereas our intervention is perhaps better placed for those people who have quite stable low levels of activity. So in the trials we've done since, we've focused on more schizophrenia type diagnoses. When we looked at this, looked at data from the trial in a bit more detail, we were interested to see what the mediators were of change in activity levels. And we found that reducing hopelessness and increasing positive beliefs about self were mediators of increased activity levels, which fitted really well with our underpinning theoretical model, where we're really suggesting that this intervention works by increasing hope and also increasing positive beliefs about self. So following the ISREP trial, so that first pilot trial that we did, we moved on to doing a larger study called the Super-Eden trial. This was a trial with participants who had experienced the first episode of psychosis and were coming to the end of their time with early intervention services. So many of you here today may well be already aware that early intervention in the UK tends to be a 3-year intervention. So people following their first episode of psychosis will stay with an early intervention service for up to 3 years and receive a range of different support. Within this trial, we were looking at supporting people who were coming to the end of early intervention. So they'd had at least a year of early intervention, but more commonly 2 years of early intervention service provision, but we're still struggling with social recovery. And here, as you can see from this graph here, had quite low levels of activity to start off with, around sort of 12 hours per week. And we found that compared to treatment as usual, which was nothing, treatment as usual was continuing with your early intervention service provision, adding social recovery therapy on top of that resulted in an average increase of around 8 hours per week compared to treatment as usual. So it was having quite a significant effect on increasing people's activity levels. And the nice thing about using something like the Time Use Survey to measure activity is that we all know what 8 hours of activity might look like. It's a working day, it's a full day of activity per week. So actually that's quite a meaningful shift in activity levels over time. So we've got some quite good evidence now that this intervention does work, that it does have an impact on increasing people's activity levels. And off the back of these studies that we've done, particularly the Super Eden trial, NIHR, which is an organisation that funds health research here in the UK, released this signal suggesting that this looks like a positive intervention, which could really have a positive effect on increasing activity levels for people with first episode or early psychosis. So, having talked about the evidence base a little bit to you now, I'm going to move on quite swiftly to thinking about some of the intervention techniques in a bit more detail to give you a bit of a flavour of what it might look like in practice. So I'm going to go through the different stages that I mentioned earlier, starting with the first stage, which is around engagement, assessment and formulation. So when we have analysed the content of the therapy sessions that we've done as part of our trial, so we've recorded therapy sessions, we've used the adherence scale to really have a good look at what's actually going on in the intervention sessions. We've found that all of the sessions across whatever stage of the intervention we're looking at have some focus on engagement within them. So engagement is really key. I think it's really key for people who've experienced psychosis anyway. It's key for all psychological interventions and all psychological work, but I think particularly for a group that may have difficulty, trusting other people, may have difficulty with some of the kind of intimacies of social interaction, really building up a good relationship and a good trusting relationship is really, really key. So you can see here are some quotes from people who took part in our trials about what they thought about the intervention. They're talking about the therapist understanding them on a personal level, and that being not kind of unprofessional, but really getting to know the person rather than going straight into the therapy. Really developing that relationship first and kind of feeling comfortable within that to then go on and do the further work. And to give you a kind of sense of what that engagement work might look like, we're really following quite an assertive outreach model within this intervention. It's really about meeting people where they want to be seen, engaging with people through really getting to know them, maybe through helping them with some practical things that they're perhaps struggling with to start off with. Maybe people need help thinking about securing their benefits or where they're living or their living situation, but really kind of developing that kind of trust, supporting people and getting to know them through their kind of interests and what's important to them. We talk about this idea of kind of contagious hopefulness as well. So often a lot of the people that we've worked with using this approach have lost a lot of their hope for what they can achieve in the future. And their hope for a kind of positive outcome for themselves, or even their hope for experiencing pleasure when they go out and do something. They just perhaps aren't expecting that to happen. So we talk about the role of the therapist as as maintaining that hope and holding on to that hope where perhaps the individual's lost it. And this idea of kind of contagious hopefulness, so hopefully some of that will, will stick and will kind of catch on, and that hopefulness will start to infiltrate the kind of wider system around the person. We often find it's not uncommon that people might perhaps feel a little bit ambivalent about whether they want to engage with this work. So it may be, in the early days that people attend 1 or 2 sessions and then don't attend, and that you have to kind of do some work to kind of re-engage with people, but also try and understand, well, what is it that means that you perhaps aren't feeling quite sure about doing this? What are your kind of worries about that? And trying to find the thing that's going to kind of help people to remain kind of engaged. What's the kind of hook? What's the thing that people are kind of really interested in? So I think activity can be really useful in developing that relationship, because people will be spending their time doing something. So even if people are at home, they're unlikely to be, sleeping for 24 hours a day, and they're going to be engaging in something. That might be, a particular hobby that doesn't involve interacting with other people, or it may be playing video games. So really trying to kind of understand what does give people a kind of sense of joy, even if it's very, very small. So, for example, I've learned a huge amount about particular kinds of video games, or manga art, or particular kind of comic book series, because people are spending time at home reading those things or engaging in those activities. So, trying to kind of find a way to engage with people on a kind of common ground where maybe they can teach you something to kind of develop that relationship. And we often find that I've talked about kind of the median number of sessions being 19 over a 9-month period, but we often find that the initial sessions, you might have more regular or intense contact initially whilst you're developing that relationship and an understanding with the person, and then that might reduce a bit more or get a bit more spaced out over time. But things are very active in those early days. We talk a lot about this idea of the self as a hero. A lot of times people might feel quite stigmatized. They may have internalized stigma, or they may have experienced stigma from other people, and perhaps feel like they've failed in some way, particularly if they've had to drop out of college or work because of their psychosis. So we use this idea of building a self as hero narrative, that yes, all these horrible things have happened to you, but you've got through that. You're getting through it. What is that? What does that say about you, that actually you've kept on going despite that adversity that you faced? And try to encourage people to develop some kind of self-compassion about what they've been through and what they are working through. And that actually, in order to get to where they are now, in order to have got through that really acute episode of psychosis, they must have some hidden resilience. And how might we kind of tap into that? And you can use what you're learning about the person's interests to kind of tap into that as well. So to go back to that example of me learning a lot about particular video games, is there a particular character in a computer game that the person is playing at the moment who keeps on going despite that adversity? Can the person see some of themselves within that character, or some similarities there? And really try to build on that positive sense of self, and to use that as a foundation to grow. We also talk a lot about walking alongside, both literally and metaphorically, because actually a lot of these early sessions may involve going out and having a walk. In our experience, a lot of young people who've experienced psychosis find it quite difficult to sit in a clinic room face to face with somebody and talk about how they're feeling, or talk about some of this stuff. So sometimes just going out for a walk and being alongside someone rather than face to face with someone can facilitate some of these discussions. But you're also walking alongside that person in their journey to recovery. So of course, this is a professional relationship, it's not a friendship, but actually, you may accompany someone to certain activities in a way that perhaps you wouldn't do if you spend most of your professional life sort of doing one-to-one work in a clinic. We're really looking for that kind of human connection here, and to use that kind of human connection as a way to give somebody a positive experience of human connection that they may not currently have, and to generate a sense of optimism and excitement for the future. So that was a lot about engagement, but it's also about assessment as well, because whilst you're getting to know the person, you are starting to build an assessment of what their current difficulties are, what's getting in the way, and how you're going to understand that in terms of the formulation. So you're going to be doing an assessment like you perhaps normally would in any other setting. We want to know what are the current difficulties that somebody's having. What were they doing before they had the psychosis? What are they doing now? What's the impact of that episode of psychosis been? What are the current symptoms that people are experiencing? And that might be both residual psychotic symptoms, but we know from the literature that social anxiety and low mood are very common comorbidities in people who've experienced psychosis. So we want to know, are people experiencing social anxiety or low mood? Is that getting in the way in terms of their social recovery? We also want to know, what are people's kind of beliefs about themselves and other people? How hopeful do they feel for the future? So we're collecting a range of information in the way that you would kind of in a standard assessment before you were doing any kind of intervention, but remembering that the focus here is on trying to understand what's getting in the way of kind of functioning and social recovery. So you can gain assessment information through a range of different sources. Obviously, you're going to be wanting to have conversations with the individual, but you may, obviously with people's consent, want to talk to people around them as well. So you may want to talk to family members if they're living with family. There may be other people that you might want to talk to about how this person's kind of getting on. And you may also, it's not just a may, actually, we think it's really important to also conduct a real world observation of kind of how people are getting on. And so some of that, I talked about kind of literally walking alongside people, some of that actually going out quite early on for a walk and seeing how are people conducting themselves outside in the world. Are they walking with head down? Are they avoiding eye contact with other people? What are the kinds of safety behaviours that maybe they're engaging in, which are stopping them from gaining kind of information which might challenge some of their beliefs about themselves? So you want to do a mix of actually having conversations with people, but also doing that real world observation as well. So as well as focusing on the difficulties that people are having, we also want to focus on the future, and we want to focus on people's goals and hopes and values for the future. So often we might borrow tools from, say, acceptance and commitment therapy to think about doing values-based assessment. What's important to somebody? What lights them up? What motivates them? And how much are people kind of living in line with those values at the moment versus not? And what would people like to do more of or less of? So focusing on what's holding people back, but also on kind of where they want to go. And then this is what I was talking about in relation to that sort of real world assessment. So as early on as you possibly can, actually going out just for a short walk or spending some time outside of the clinic room to really see what is going on for that person when they are out and about in the real world, and how anxious does it make them. So trying to sort of get a picture of that. So what you're trying to do as you're gathering this information is feed that into a formulation of social recovery. And we're doing that in a longitudinal way. So we want to know, what were things like before the psychosis? What are they like now? What are the things that on a day-to-day basis are maybe maintaining some of the difficulties that people have? So the barriers that we're really focusing on here are the barriers to people engaging in activity. What stops you? So it's not necessarily the things that are maintaining people's anxiety, but rather what are the things that kind of keep you withdrawn from the outside world, and how can we kind of understand those better? And it's absolutely fine, and we absolutely do in this approach borrow from other cognitive models to help us to understand this. So we find that social anxiety is really common in people who are struggling with their social recovery. So we may borrow from some of the maintenance cycles contained in cognitive models of social anxiety, such as the Clark and Wells model, to try and understand that a bit more and to build that into the formulation. But as well as thinking about those individual things, we're also thinking about those wider systemic factors that might be getting in the way too. So I'm not expecting you to read this slide in detail, and you can certainly sort of come back to it later on, or I'm happy to kind of go through it in a bit more detail. But what you're looking at developing here through the formulation is a longitudinal model similar to sort of this, where you are looking at people's kind of early experiences, things that perhaps happened prior to the psychosis, things that they were maybe struggling with before, then thinking about the psychosis and how that's then perhaps further impacted on people's kind of social and personal development, and then looking at the here and now. What are the cognitive and behavioural patterns that keep people withdrawn, that result in a kind of pattern of avoidance to perhaps keep people safe? And I've got several examples here on this slide of different things that might be considered as barriers. You may find that not all of them are relevant and that some of them are more relevant than others, but we're talking about behavioral barriers, we're talking about cognitive barriers, we're talking about people's worldviews and how they feel about themselves, other people, and the world around them. Emotional barriers, if people feel particularly anxious or they go into certain situations and it triggers feelings of shame, does that promote them? Does that promote withdrawal or avoidance? Thinking about kind of ongoing symptoms that might be kind of getting in the way. So, for example, if people go out and they start to feel perhaps a little bit paranoid or experience symptoms of social anxiety, does that then trigger concerns about relapse? And then that ends up meaning that people then withdraw to keep themselves safe. We might think about any kind of physiological barriers. So it may be that people have been withdrawn for some time and therefore actually their fitness levels are quite low. So actually when they go out, they do feel quite tired, or they might experience some physical symptoms that they then feel worried about, and that might be keeping them stuck. We've talked a little bit about already the systemic barriers. So what are other people's expectations of this person in terms of other health professionals, but also family members? Are family members feeling quite traumatized and anxious about what's happened in the past and really want to stop that from happening again? And then, with all the best intentions, become perhaps quite protective of their loved one, but it stops them from having those opportunities of actually re-engaging with the world around them. And then we've talked about also practical barriers. So it may be that there are financial constraints on the person in terms of what activities they're able to engage in, or it may be that they have unstable housing or other issues which are getting in the way. So, it's unlikely that you'll have a formulation that's perhaps as full as this, but through the assessment, you're trying to capture a really good understanding of all the things that might be getting in the way. What are the things that are kind of most problematic and the things that really most need to be focused on to then guide your treatment plan? So then we perhaps come on to the more sort of active sort of intervention components, although I would argue that kind of engagement assessment phase is actually quite an active intervention in itself in terms of developing that relationship and really just developing a shared narrative of what the person's been through. And of course, they're finding it difficult to engage in the things that they want to, and getting a really good sense of what they want in the future, because for some people they may have lost sight of that. So actually all of that early engagement assessment work is also a very important part of the intervention, as well as providing the formulation to guide perhaps more targeted intervention strategies. But thinking about the kind of cognitive and behavioural strategies that we might use, as I've said, the cognitive features of the intervention do focus more on building up the positive rather than perhaps challenging the negative. So here's a quote from a participant from one of our trials where they say that, actually following doing this intervention, I do feel a lot more positive. I see a future for myself. There were a couple of years with my illness when I didn't and I couldn't do anything, but I'm past that now and I can see that, I'm hopeful for the future. So that's really what we're trying to build with people. So I won't sort of labour this point too much in the interests of time, but as said here, our cognitive work is really trying to generate those positive self-beliefs and that hope for social recovery. And we might do that using things like thought records, collecting positive data logs. So when people do have positive experiences, making sure that we're keeping a record of that, because we know, we all have tendency to focus on the negative. People who are experiencing low mood or mental health problems perhaps have that a bit more. So we're really wanting people to keep a record of when good things do happen, that you really want to remember that and how we're going to note that down, as well as the use of kind of positive self-statements and really building up that image of what they want to be doing in the future and what that might look like, and being able to draw on that image in times of difficulty. So just to give you a kind of more concrete example of that, one of the young chaps that I worked with, he was really interested in kind of history and archaeology. And that was one of the things that he was kind of wanted to pursue a bit more, and maybe in terms of his future career or, kind of future options. And we developed together this kind of image of himself as somebody who did that kind of thing. So he would think about, well, historians and kind of history professors, they might wear a tweed coat with leather elbow patches. So whenever he was perhaps feeling a bit anxious about engaging in some of this work, we would talk about, well, let's imagine, putting on that tweed jacket with the leather elbow patches, and can we really try and embody some of that positive sense of self, and what's underpinning the driving motivation behind doing this work, and can we encourage you to think about yourself as positively in the future. So that's a little bit of a brief summary of some cognitive work, thinking about behavioural work. So we know from our analysis of the sessions that we've done as part of the trial that half of the sessions included some form of behavioural intervention. And that might look like behavioural activation or kind of graded exposure type work, or it may be an experiment, a behavioural experiment, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide, I think. And here are some quotes from people who took part in the trial again. So demonstrating that actually it is an active intervention where we're actually going out and doing things and going out and trying things. So it was very much more working with the problems that you experience day to day. One of my anxieties was standing in queues. I hated standing in queues. I couldn't do it. So we'd go and stand and queue up in Costa coffee shop, because there's always quite a long queue in there, and kind of test that out. And somebody there at the end talking about the practical walking around the streets to help build confidence at getting out and about. So some of that behavioural work will happen in the session together jointly with the therapist, and some of it would then be followed up in between sessions as homework. So yeah, talked about behavioural activation and experiments, which are very much in line with activities that are meaningful to the person. And thinking about kind of multi-layering of behavioural experiments as well. So what we try and do when we do the behavioural experiments and the intervention is really capitalise on the moment. So it may be that to start off with, as kind of the first layer of the behavioural experiment, you might set up quite a simple experiment. Okay, so somebody may have fears that actually, if I go out and walk around town, people are going to judge me, people are going to look at me. So you might set up quite a standard experiment that you might see in any social anxiety intervention of, well, let's go and test that out. Let's go and walk around the centre of town and see, are people looking at you? Are people judging you? But what you're doing when you're doing that experiment is trying to then layer in other opportunities for learning and new experiences. So there might be a second layer where we're trying to additionally promote social recovery. So whilst we're out and about, what's it like, being out and about? It might be a sunny day. What's that like, being out in the sunshine rather than staying at home? Are you seeing anything interesting or anything that kind of sparks your interest whilst you're out and about? So keeping with this theme of computer games, there might be an interesting new computer game shop that's opened in town, or that this person's not seen any before. And that's when we might get this third layer. This may not happen every time, but we're always looking for these opportunities when we're going out and about to capitalise on the moment. oh, there's an interesting new computer shop over there. Should we go in and have a bit of a look around? I wonder, do you think you could maybe try speaking to the shop assistant or asking them about any new games that you might enjoy? So we're really trying to weave in not just testing or challenging a kind of negative belief, but additional opportunities to promote that social recovery. And we've got some more examples of these layered behavioural experiments in our treatment manual, which you can download from the website. And then the multisystemic work. So we know from our analysis of the interventions through that we've done in the trial that at least 20% of sessions have a multisystemic component, and there might be further work in between sessions as well. So it may be that there's a family session where you share the formulation with family members. It may be that you go along to a voluntary opportunity. It may be that there's an opportunity to take up a voluntary position in a charity shop, or I'm just trying to think of a real life example that we had in the trial of a wildlife rescue centre. Somebody was very interested in animals and went along to visit a wildlife rescue centre and to explore whether there were any voluntary opportunities. Went along with the therapist, but the purpose of the therapist going is to continue building that rapport, to provide that kind of support with doing these activities that might make people feel anxious. But really importantly, it's about capitalizing on new information that you learn through that. Okay, so we went and did that visit to that wildlife centre, and we spoke to the person about voluntary jobs or voluntary opportunities, and you were able to talk to them about your interests and hold a conversation for 20 minutes. Like, what was that like? Did you think you'd be able to do that? So you can actually use the information that you learn through these experiences to really try and challenge negative beliefs, but also really build up that positive sense of self. So yeah, a little bit more here about kind of the purpose of the multisystemic components of the intervention. We're wanting to advocate for the client, the service user, if people are finding that difficult to do for themselves. We're wanting to break down stigma, if there is any there within the system, and provide education on mental health and what psychosis is and what it's not, to try and kind of educate people within the system, particularly employers or education providers. But we're also wanting to build a support system around the person as well. So the therapy may be quite intensive and it may last for a significant length of time, but it's not going to go on for a lifetime. So what we're wanting to do is build up a support system around the person that's going to be sustainable once the therapy finishes, as well as thinking about plugging clients and service users into organisations that might be able to further support them in the long run. So I think I've come to the end of the kind of formal slides. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Hopefully it wasn't too fast. Try and sort of talk to you a bit about the underpinning research that we've done leading to this intervention, talk to you about the evidence base and the trials that we've done, and then give you a bit of a flavour of the actual techniques. It's quite a lot to fit into an hour. So I think we've now got half an hour or so to have some discussion and questions. Okay, so we've got anonymous attendee question about, have the same techniques worked for people who use marijuana, cannabis, or have addiction issues? Really great question. We haven't excluded people who have substance misuse difficulties from our trials generally, unless that's kind of obviously the primary issue. We're recruiting people, or we've recruited people into our studies from early intervention or through NHS mental health services. So we haven't excluded people for that reason, and I think there's no reason why it couldn't work. I mean, we haven't specifically done a trial looking at this approach for people with substance misuse issues, but I think one of the kind of hallmarks of social recovery difficulties is complexity and comorbidity, and so things like addiction, or difficulties of that nature are certainly part of that complexity and comorbidity. So obviously you would need to think about integrating that within the formulation, and probably build in some work with other services to kind of help support that, and also really think with the individual about, can they see how that addiction might be compromising their ability to move towards the things that they want to do, and what function is it serving for them, in terms of, is it helping them to escape or avoid, so I think you certainly could. It's not something that we've looked at specifically, but it's not something that I would say would preclude somebody from taking part in an intervention like this. Tracy Windsor, thank you for your question, Tracy. How do you see peer support involved in social recovery therapy? Well, I think peer support could mesh really nicely, with this approach. And we are looking at the moment at doing some further research about thinking about broadening out the group of people who can actually administer this intervention. So because we've been looking at doing clinical trials and generating kind of data around, does this intervention work, the trials that we've done so far have used clinical psychologists and trained cognitive behavioural therapists to deliver this intervention. But we're really thinking at the moment that actually, is that needed? Could we think about a broader pool of individuals actually being able to deliver this intervention? So I think it could work really well. And obviously some of the approaches around supporting people in daily activities could work really nicely. Peer support workers are kind of doing that. I think what we would need to think about, or what would be important to consider, is really skilling peer support workers up if they don't have these skills already, or kind of alerting them to the fact that they are using these skills already, but making that explicit. These kind of in the moment opportunities that I was talking about when you're going out and supporting somebody to do an activity. So it's not just about walking alongside, although I don't want to say that that's not important, because that's super important, but it's also about capitalizing in the moment on what have you learned through doing that. It's not just about the fact that you did it and that's great, but also how can we use the information that you've gained from that experience to build that positive sense of self, or to challenge some of those negative beliefs. How can we feed it back into our understanding that you were able to do that, and what did you learn? So it's that sort of slight nuance, but I think it could work super well with peer support.
Jo, I'm curious. I think some of this question could be the way that mental health services are set up in the US, and it's the same in some parts of the British system also, in that it'd be quite unusual in many mental health settings in the US for a therapist to go out with somebody somewhere. The way that people's time is billed, and there's a lot of high pressure for turnover, it can make that challenging. So I wonder if this approach can be put into more like team-based approaches, where maybe there is a supportive person, a peer, or somebody else doing that piece, and then maybe a therapist coming in within that team to do that certain piece that you're referring to, as in cementing those like therapy-based skills. Not that I'm saying that a peer therapist shouldn't be trained in this, but I'm thinking about those practical issues when it comes to implementing this in the US.
Yeah, and I think that's also true of the UK, because although therapists have done this kind of work, it is more intensive because it takes longer, so you can see fewer people in a day because you're doing a lot of going out and about, and the sessions themselves are kind of longer. So something that we're thinking about at the moment, we haven't tested it in the research that we've done, but something we're thinking about at the moment is having a kind of skill mix model, where you would have perhaps a therapist kind of holding the case and involved in that formulation and the kind of understanding of the barriers to social recovery, but some of the pieces of work would be done with the peer, or with somebody else within the team, but that there would be a shared formulation within the team that everybody was kind of feeding into. So it's not something we've tested, but in terms of a kind of rollout implementation model, it's something that we're kind of exploring at the minute. Right, Emma, in the UK, in England. Hi, Emma. So the NICE guidelines recommend CBT for psychosis. How does this fit in? So it's not. This isn't an approach that's currently recommended in NICE guidelines in the UK, as you'll know, Emma. I think it's just different to CBT for psychosis. I think obviously when doing CBT for psychosis, you're not necessarily always focusing on symptom reduction. You know, functional outcomes can be something that you're working towards, but the model that underpins CBT for psychosis is really about psychotic symptoms and reducing those, or reducing the distress that's associated with them. So I think there are some similarities, but it's different in its focus, and the model that's kind of underpinning it. And so it may be that it's used for, or that its apply is more applicable to people who are perhaps through that more acute phase of psychosis, and where the main problem or the main thing that they're struggling with is re-engaging in activity. Anna has 2 questions and says, can she raise her hand? You're very welcome to raise your hand, Emma, if you're able to do that.
If not, free to put it in the Q&A. It may be a little in the webinar format. It can be challenging to allow people to speak.
Okay,
it's a bit different to a Zoom webinar, but please feel free to put it in the chat.
I can see one of your questions, I think, Anna, about 19 sessions, and whether that's enough to give the person the resources they need to continue alone. I can't sort of conclusively tell you that from a kind of evidence-based perspective, Emma. I mean, I know, Anna, sorry, I know that the trials that we've done, we have done a kind of 6-month follow-up. So we've looked at how people are doing right at the end of therapy, and then we follow them up 6 months after the end of therapy to see how things are doing. We have some indication that some of those gains are maintained. I think, you know, it may be useful to think about an approach where there could be some kind of top-up sessions, perhaps, if people need it. I think you can get quite a long way in 19 sessions. I would say that's my experience, and you can start to I can't kind of say really enough about the fact that building that hope and that kind of more positive sense of self is really, really key. So one of the things that we perhaps have done in the trials, or as we've kind of come to the end of therapy, is to really, really think about the end of therapy planning and providing a bit of a blueprint for people to take forward for themselves. So what are the techniques and the resources that you've learned? How can we put those in a format that you're going to continue to be able to use those? And I've also utilized kind of therapy ending letters quite successfully. So, you know, really talking to people in a letter about, this is where you were when we first met and this is where you are now. And one person who, when I finished the therapy with them, said, oh, I'll stick that on my fridge, you can nag me from there from now on. So there is that sort of sense that you know, they said that in a nice way, you know, that actually people, you aren't leaving people at that point where they're exactly where they want to go, but you've kind of set them on a track. So David Fowler often uses quite a lot of kind of sailing metaphors. So he will talk about, you know, people having had acute psychosis and it being like sailing a ship in a storm, and you have to kind of batten down the hatches. And then when you come out of that acute phase, it's about resetting your course. And I think that's really what we're trying to do here. So you may not have got people a job, or you may not have got people back to college, but you've kind of reset them on a course where they feel like that's something that they can do. And I think in terms of kind of in the trials, we're kind of limited by how long we can follow people up. I think if you were doing this in practice, it may be that you could build in particular things to follow people up. So, you know, timing doesn't always work perfectly, but, you know, it may be that somebody wants to restart college, and, you know, that tends to happen in the autumn. You know, that's when people tend to start new college courses. So if you finish with someone in the spring, it may be that you may want to build something in sort of closer to the autumn to see whether people are actually doing that, and do they need a bit more. Then we'll see limited as to how we can do that in a trial setting. But I think certain things like that might help in terms of maintaining those gains. Hopefully that's answered at least one of your questions, Anna. If you've got another one, please do put it in the box. Okay, another anonymous question. Has there been any research done on SRT for people who are experiencing active psychosis? How does it compare for SRT for people who are coming out of episodes, or who are experiencing lower level psychotic symptoms? So no, we haven't done research on people who, with people who have more active psychosis. Although I would say that some of the people that have taken part in the trials have had quite significant levels of psychotic symptoms, so actually managing voices or managing paranoia has been more of a part of the intervention. And I do wonder, I mean, I don't know, and we haven't done the research, so I can't say this, with any certainty, but I do wonder whether for people who might find it quite difficult to talk about some of these difficult experiences that they're having, that focus on something that's more positive or something that they can work towards, maybe more palatable, rather than focusing perhaps on the distress. So we haven't done it with more active psychosis, and I think going back to the previous question about when CBT for psychosis may be more appropriate, that might be more appropriate at that stage. But given how early some of these social recovery difficulties start, I think keeping that on the agenda quite early is really important, as well as obviously managing, the active psychosis itself. Okay. Kate, are there books or stories you've shared with clients that depict people with lived experience with hope and positivity, like a character in a story or a memoir, perhaps? That's a really lovely question, Kate. Thank you. There aren't kind of specific ones that I would say that we've always recommended, but certainly we would encourage people to we might orient people to stories of maybe famous people who've struggled with hearing voices, or to kind of normalize some of the experiences that people have had. And certainly we've used I've talked about the kind of computer game analogy throughout the presentation. If it really aligns with somebody's interests, so maybe there's a particular form of art or a particular hobby or interest that somebody has, if there is some way of bringing that in, that's been really helpful. And so computer games, and certainly kind of graphic novels, or a lot of the young people that I've worked with have been really interested in manga art forms, which often depict kind of stories of tragedy or heroes or survival or a battle or a fight or people achieving something, can be really useful things for people to draw on to kind of put themselves in that sort of position. But I think, there may well be particular stories that are useful. I think in terms of maintaining that kind of sense of hopefulness that actually you can come out of this and achieve something, that is really important. Ivy, do you ever have more than one participant go on events together or engage in social activity together? We haven't, but I have been involved in other research where social groups have been a part of that, and I have wondered, whether there would be at some point a role for having some sort of group activity, or some sort of group component to a social recovery approach, particularly if you were implementing it in a clinical setting and you already had a group that was kind of going on, because connecting with other people, and particularly other people who've had lived experience, can, as we know, be really powerful for people. So we haven't, but when we did the qualitative work asking people how they found the intervention, I'm pretty sure that at least one, and maybe more than one person, said something about how it would have been really nice to meet other people. So we haven't done that specifically, but I could see how that could work. And a lot of early intervention services here in the UK will have social groups as part of their offer. So I think encouraging people to attend those has certainly been part of the social recovery work, for sure. Here in the early intervention team that I'm in, so this is Emma's question, we work with a lot of autistic people. How might this affect the SRT work? Great question. Yeah, I think we haven't measured autism or neurodiversity in the participants that we've recruited in our trials, but I would say that it's probably been there quite frequently, the degree to which some people struggle with social skills or social situations, or even if they don't have a diagnosis of neurodiversity, have perhaps been withdrawn for such a long time that actually they've never developed or lost skills or lost confidence in engaging with other people. So I don't know how much it might need to be tailored for people with specific neurodiversity. You know, there may need to be a bit more of an emphasis on social skills, or certainly thinking about how learning from one behavioural experiment might generalise to other situations. You might need to do a bit more kind of targeted work on that. So it's not something we've specifically measured, but I think it is something we've certainly seen as we've been doing this work, even if we haven't been aware of it. We haven't excluded people on the basis of having a diagnosis. And I think there's quite a lot of people who maybe have these difficulties but haven't ever thought about it in that way or been diagnosed. So I think it could work quite well, but I think, you know, there are certain things that might need more emphasis.
So I've got a question that I know came up earlier, and if it's been answered, then please forgive me. But there was a few comments in the chat and in the Q&A about the role of medication and how medication side effects can impact social recovery. Is that something that you've addressed already or have thoughts on?
We haven't addressed it, but yeah, and actually I've got a colleague here at UEA who does research into sedation and psychosis, and particularly sedation related to medication side effects. And we've talked a lot about the kind of intersection between sedation and social recovery, and how we think, again, we've not kind of formally tested it, but that actually some of these approaches might be helpful. Some of the behavioural approaches that we use within social recovery therapy might be helpful in helping with sedation, you know, because we know that although it is a common side effect of antipsychotic medication, that actually there may be non-medication things that we can do to help people to kind of cope with that. So I think it would be about how that was just brought into the formulation. So I think on the formulation slide, I talked about kind of physiological factors that might maintain poor social recovery or poor social functioning. And I think it would probably feature in there. I mean, we certainly wouldn't necessarily view this as an alternative to medication. It was very much working alongside, kind of understanding, is that the best medication for you? You know, do we need to have conversations with psychiatrists and medics about that? How have you come to be on this medication? Are there things that we can do to try and alleviate that? So again, I don't think it's something that would preclude people from taking part. I think it's something that would help in kind of understanding what the difficulties were in preventing people from kind of moving forwards, and something to maybe explore as part of the intervention. It all comes with, you know, when people are experiencing difficulties of this nature, it's often not for one reason. You know, there's often lots of complexity and comorbidities and lots of interacting factors. And part of this approach is really trying to kind of disentangle that and think about, okay, well, what are the various things that we need to consider, and what can we tweak to try and get a few gains here and a few gains there to, you know, move things forward a bit. So it would certainly be something to explore. Hopefully that answers the question. How do you work with peers experiencing debilitating insomnia that affects their willingness and ability to schedule and plan activities? So, I mean, this is sort of similar. I mean, I know insomnia is not necessarily a side effect of medication, although I guess it can be for some medications, but it would be the same for me in terms of sedation. You know, if people are feeling really sleepy, either because they haven't been sleeping or because there's medication side effects, and obviously you have to build that into formulation and kind of understand that. And it may be, and this is where we kind of can draw on other models to help with the social recovery formulation, but also the social recovery work, that actually if sleep is an issue, we may need to do a bit of sleep hygiene work, or, you know, a few sessions on that, or direct people to some additional support on that to kind of help with that. Because what you're alluding to here, it's another great question, is that there are not just barriers that are about people's beliefs about themselves, but there are, you know, barriers in terms of physiological barriers within the wider system that people are having to kind of traverse in order to kind of move forward. So it would be about integrating that into the narrative about why are you struggling, and if it was sleep that was kind of the main driving factor, we would try and do something about that, and integrate that into the intervention, or signpost people to get some additional support alongside our work to help with that. Okay, here, so a question from Anna. This might be your second question, Anna, if it's the same Anna, I think it might be. Here in LA, there is Sanji Sahosa, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, from Peer Consulting that uses somewhat of your method. He used LEAP technique. He goes where the person is located and he accompanies the person to test volunteer job, but it's ongoing support. It's not about 19 sessions. Yeah, okay, that's interesting to know about. Thank you, Anna. Penny in Cambridge. I'm not sure if we've ever met Penny. We might have, because Cambridge is not very far away from where I am. In today's UK NHS here in Cambridge, there are no community psychological workers available post the early intervention service, and none there either in our experience during lockdown. Your work is hopeful for the network around the person who will have to do this recovery work. Sent your link to my adult child's network. Do you have an idea about helping the everyday supporters beyond the good intentions you have said? Yeah, I mean, this is a really another really great question, Penny. And yeah, I mean, I think that system around the person is kind of so key. And, you know, we're talking about kind of 19 sessions and in many ways that feeling quite limited. But as you may well be aware, Penny, you know, actually 19 sessions within an NHS context is quite a lot. You know, that would be considered quite an intensive intervention. So, you know, in order to make those gains sustainable, you have to think about that kind of wider system. And although when we're doing this kind of work, our client or our service user is the individual who's experienced psychosis, you know, we are thinking about that wider system, and we may not be doing direct or individual work with the family, but certainly I can think of circumstances where we've tried to refer the family to further support, or, you know, it may be that family members, you know, having a loved one who's gone through psychosis, which it sounds like you have, Penny, you know, as you will know, is a hugely traumatic and stressful life event that often impacts on carers or informal carers or family members' well-being as well, and there often isn't, you know, support for that. So we would try to, as well as kind of offering that hope and those kind of good intentions, try to sort of signpost or plug people in as much as we could to wider support services, because, you know, in order for that wider system to support the person, there has to be support for that support system. You know, it's a kind of a ever ongoing circle, really. I hope that answers your question.
I wonder if we could take one more question in the interest of time. And I love how much interest and questions have been generated by this. And hopefully this won't be our only opportunity to explore this topic. So maybe one more question?
Yep. Okay, I'll try and pick one that maybe is a bit different to some of the ones that we've done already. Okay. How do we measure the results of SRT? I'm so glad that SRT scores seem to be recovery and cure versus management and maintenance. Yeah. So, you know, in the research that we've done, Nadia, we've used the measure, the time use survey, to look at recovery. Now, there are so many different other tools, you know, that could be used alongside that, but we're looking at, are we increasing activity levels? So we're looking at the amount of time that somebody has spent engaged in activity, but with a broader definition than simply, is someone back at work or not? You know, are they engaging in activity that's going to promote positive mental well-being? But you might also want to think about what recovery means to the individual and use some more personalized measures as well. You know, we think about the goals that people set for themselves, or using something like a values map from acceptance and commitment therapy, and thinking about, are people living more in line with their values at the end of the intervention than they were at the start? So there's a range of different ways of kind of doing that, but our method particularly is around time use. Showing my slides.